Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I am Elise Donovan for BVI Finance and your moderator for today's discussion. As some of you have joined us early, you would have seen some of the discussion has already been very lively and started. But for today's panel discussion, we are going to be talking about the implications of the recent United Kingdom elections on international finance centers and our financial services industry. As many of you know, the UK elections were held on the 4th of July, and the results have ushered in a new Labour government, marking a significant shift in the country's political landscape. Our discussion today will focus on the potential impact this change in government could have on international finance centers such as the British Virgin Islands and the broader financial services industry. We will explore how the Labour government's policies and their approach to governance might influence regulatory frameworks, economic stability, and financial transparency, both domestically and internationally, with a specific focus on the international finance centers. We are honored to have a very distinguished panel of experts, and I was just sitting quietly listening to their expertise on the UK elections, and I am marveled by how much their knowledge is on everything that has transpired. We are honored to have this distinguished panel to delve into the topics. Mitchell Cohen, he's head of public affairs at public relations firm Lansenstein Pharma and a prominent voice in public policy. We have Oliver Cooper, he's the counsel for the International Finance Center IFC Forum, and he brings a wealth of legal expertise and insight into regulatory environment of international finance centers. And of course, we have Benito Weekly, who's a special envoy to the government of the Virgin Islands, and he offers a unique perspective from one of the key international finance centers, of course, the British Virgin Islands. And he's going to let us know more about that and how the UK policies will affect us. Our panelists are going to talk more about themselves, just going to give us a brief background as to why they're here and what expertise they bring to the table. Our panelists will provide insights into the key economic and financial policies of the new government, examine the potential changes in relations with the overseas territories, and discuss the broader implications, as I said, for our financial services industry. In particular, we will discuss the roles of key figures in the new government, such as Foreign Secretary David Lammy and Minister of State who has responsibility for the overseas territories, Stephen Doughty, and how their positions might shape the policies affecting international finance centers. Thank you all for joining us. And before we begin, let me do some housekeeping. Please place your questions or comments in the question and answer tab, and then we'll address them to the end. We will let the discussion free flow. As I said, these experts are quite interesting and have a lot to offer. So we'll just have a free flow discussion this morning. And I want to thank you all for joining, and I want to thank our panelists for making themselves available for today's discussion. And I'm going to ask them to first start and introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about your background and expertise in political affairs. Mitch.
Just up. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining, and thank you, Elise, for inviting me this morning. Very briefly, I'm head of public affairs at Lansons. I've been here for 8 years. Before that, I was an advisor to former Defence Secretary, at the time Party Chair Grant Shapps. and was seconded over to work for Boris Johnson in the 2019 general election. The past 2 years, I've been working on building those relationships with the Labour Party, especially within sort of Rachel Reeves and the Treasury team, to really get a bit of a flavour and understanding on what that means. I've worked sort of with the Office the Overseas Territories and Crown Dependencies for my 8 years at Lansons, formerly with the Isle of Man. I've worked with Oliver with the IFC Forum, and most recently been working with BVI Government and BVI Finance on some of their public affairs work. So great to meet you all, and thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining. Benito.
Thank you, Elise, and good morning to everyone. It's definitely a pleasure to be here. I am the special envoy of the Premier, but I have worked with every BVI government administration since 2003. So I've seen the ups and the downs, the highs and the lows of our relationship with the UK. I am also a policy fellow at the Center for Science and Policy at the University of Cambridge. So in that capacity, I consider issues affecting small jurisdictions as it relates to the UK. So pleasure to be here again. Thank you so much for the kind invitation.
And you spent how many years as the UK EU representative based out of London? How many years, Ben? Okay, he's frozen. I hope we can get him back shortly. So we'll go on to Oliver Cooper.
Yeah, thank you so much to everyone and to Elise for extending this invite. My name is Oliver Cooper. I work for Charles Russell Speechlys, where I act as policy lead, advising clients on international tax, trade, financial services regulation, that sort of matter, including a number of governments around the world, as well as acting as counsel to the International Financial Centres Forum, the IFC Forum, which includes amongst its members most of the largest law firms and financial services and professional services firms in the Crown Dependencies and the Overseas Territories, including BVI. Separately from that, I have many years of experience in UK politics, being a public office holder myself, and I am the leader, sadly, given the election result, the leader of the Conservatives in a part of the country. So I will bring, hopefully, my perspective without shedding too many tears at the same time.
Thank you. Ben, before you dropped off, I was asking you to expand on your brief bio and let us know how many years you've spent in the UK as the EU UK representative for the BVI.
Yes, sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened to my connection. But yes, I spent just over 8 years at our London office. And half of that time I spent as the representative, BVI representative to the UK and the EU. And prior to that, I was a deputy. So I have some experience on the ground in the UK as well. And I maintain my links with the UK via my policy fellowship at the University of Cambridge.
Okay. As you've heard, a very informed panel of experts with great experience in political affairs. On the 4th of July, the UK elections happened, and it paved the way for a Labour government. What were the decisive factors that resulted in this shift?
Should I, Oliver, do you want to go first? Should I go first?
Of course.
Okay.
Well, many of you might remember the disastrous Liz Truss budget that took place almost 2 years ago now, which additionally other factors around the world caused a catastrophic impact on our economy. And lots of UK mortgage owners had something called a mortgage bomb, which basically went off and people were paying a lot more tax and a lot higher rates of their mortgages. Now, there were external factors, but a lot of it was Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, the Chancellor at the time, just went a bit too fast, a bit too quickly. And it caused the entire economy to sort of crash, essentially. It's the easiest way of putting it. And many people started to feel that in their pockets. And what Rishi Sunak had to do when he became prime minister was try to build up economic credibility again, bring down inflation, and make people feel better off. Now, it's a really tough job, especially after 14 years, to turn it around. And Rishi Sunak is not really the kind of person or personality to be able to do that either. So lots of people would say the writing was already on the wall. It was very, very difficult for anybody to win the election. But what Keir Starmer was able to do over the past 5 years was to really change the Labour Party, move them from what was seen as more of a protest group under Jeremy Corbyn, more of a, against NATO, against the Trident nuclear deterrent, tax the rich as high as possible, invest in as much public service as you can by borrowing. Essentially, he's changed the party around into something that was a much more centrist, palatable party for the mainstream. And a lot of those people that refused to vote for Jeremy Corbyn at the last election. Now, the pandemic obviously got in the way and delayed some of that policy development. But he was able to stand on a change. And after 14 and a half years, change is what a lot of people in the country decided that they wanted. And they were able to build a coalition of voters around the country who wanted to stop the Conservatives coming back and punish them for what was many see as the Conservatives crashing the economy about 2 years ago. I'll start there because we'll delve into a lot more of the issues, but I'm sure Oliver, you might want to add a few.
Oliver, you were integral part of that, and you said without shedding too many tears. So from your perspective.
Yeah, I should clarify, I was not a member of the government at any of those times or advised them, but you're absolutely right. That last point, Mitchell, is I think the key one. More than record, the idea that change was what the public wanted. Now, in most elections, the public will say they want change. And the real challenge in elections is the opposition needs to say that they are a credible change that will not just blow the doors off, but rather is change in a positive sense. And the government in any election needs to say, we can offer change without changing the political party that forms the government. So they need to offer a positive vision of what they want to do going forwards. And as Mitchell said, Labour did a very, very good job of showing that they were a safe pair of hands that could take over the baby of the economy. They could take over the responsibility of being that change. And the government, Rishi Sunak, did not present a vision as to how he would change. In fact, quite the opposite. His narrative into the election was, we have a plan, it is working, don't change your horse in the middle of the stream, to quote Abraham Lincoln. And the fact is that people did not think it was working. I personally think that the economy is doing better than the public did. But there's no point trying to lecture the public and trying to tell the public that things are going better. They wanted change. And the question, therefore, going forwards is how that change will be harnessed and how that demand for change will be responded to by Labour. On a number of domestic policy fronts so far, they've already announced quite radical changes in housing and planning reform within a matter of days, even hours, of forming the government. And they'll no doubt want to maintain a fast drumbeat of changes that respond to the concerns that came up over those 14 years in government, but particularly the last two, where they've been seen as being a vessel for responsible change. So we await to see how that will be channeled into our world in tax and the relationship with the overseas territories and financial services. The one other element I would note, it doesn't necessarily impact on the Labour Party a huge amount, but it certainly contributed to the scale of the defeat and to the political narrative around the election. It was Nigel Farage and Reform UK, which emerged as a third political force or fourth political force, depending on how you rank them, for the first time in a decade. They had done so previously in 2015, but haven't done so more recently. He broke through on this platform of change, on this platform of saying that Rishi Sunak had not delivered change fast enough, particularly on immigration, and they do represent a broad sort of populist perspective. Farage is very closely allied personally and politically to Donald Trump. They do represent a broad, the system is not working attitude. Now, they are unlikely, in my opinion, to change Labour Party's policies. Right now, they look like they're taking mostly votes from the Conservative Party, and Keir Starmer, the last thing he'll be doing is listening to the Nigel Farage playbook. But that might change at the end of this parliament. It will certainly impact Conservative Party thinking right now, because the narrative right now is it is those lost votes to reform that led to this defeat. The reality is far more nuanced to that. It's more about votes being lost all over and voters staying at home, but that's certainly a factor to be considered in terms of the impact on Westminster.
Just to give a bit more of a flavour.
Go ahead, Nick.
Sorry. No, I was just going to give a bit more of a flavour is Keir Starmer didn't have to say anything during the general election campaign. He didn't unveil a single actual policy, broad brush stroke ideas of planning reform or other announcements around housing targets, but he didn't give a specific, and technically, except for planning, he still hasn't really given a specific policy. And firstly, he didn't have to. He had a 20-point lead for the majority of the election and before that. So what his rule was is don't say anything that is going to change that. Don't do a Theresa May. Now, you might remember back in 2017, Theresa May had about a 20-point lead, and she was expected to win a huge landslide victory and ended up in a hung parliament territory. That's exactly what he wanted to avoid happening, and he did it. He didn't have to say anything. He barely, I don't know if anyone ever saw any of the debates that happened. I know Elise was planning on watching one of them because we spoke just before, but, Rishi was really able to attack Keir Starmer on tax, and he didn't have to say anything and still managed to win with a huge 174 majority. And some of the argument is they didn't have they actually didn't have a lot of policy. And mainly, as I said before, the pandemic meant they didn't have the time to create the policies that they wanted. They also didn't have the talent. So in opposition, you don't have as much money. So you can't invest in some of those think tanks and areas and people to come up with those tangible policies you might want to take to the country. What we're starting to see now and ahead of the King's speech, which is happening tomorrow, is quite a lot of really quick thinking. Obviously, there's ideas of policy, but what's the actual nitty-gritty policy that people need to understand and get under the bonnet of? We've seen that sort of rapidly happen over the election campaign and now. And tomorrow will be the first time we genuinely see what Labour Party policy is going to look like. So for those of you that don't know, the King's speech, which is the state opening of Parliament and the opportunity for the government to set out their stall for the year, that's going to happen tomorrow. And we're expecting, I think there's be over 20 bills, which will not have all the detail, but will start to give us some detail. Things like rental reform, things like prison reform, planning reform, reform of the House of Lords. They're going to create a retirement age, get rid of hereditary peers, and then votes for 16. Just some of the ideas that we've seen come to the fore in the past few days. But again, a lot of that detail, which has lacked and didn't come out in the campaign, is likely to come through tomorrow.
We definitely heard from the manifesto what their policies, but what is the impact for international finance into overseas territories? What are we going to likely hear tomorrow that is specific to us as international finance centers? And how in line will it be with what we saw in the manifesto?
I think, to be honest, tomorrow there will not be any announcements. I don't think, unless I've missed any sort of trail, I don't think there'll be any announcements that directly or even indirectly impact on the overseas territories, on IFCs or onto the tax agenda. In part, that will be obviously because tax itself only goes through the Finance Act rather than through other pieces of legislation. So that wouldn't be mentioned in the King's speech at all tomorrow. And then things like the relationship with the overseas territory, there was a review that was due to report just when the election was called. A lot of work had been done between the UK and the overseas territories governments over a long period of time to get that review in place and conducted. That is sitting on David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary's new Foreign Secretary's desk, awaiting whether revisions or review of that strategy are going to have to take place. But that's not going to require legislation. That is an administrative document, a statement of the government's executive functions and approach. So that's not going to be the King's speech either. And similarly, all the other things that people fear, or sometimes expect or hope to be in there, such as regarding beneficial ownership registers, that sort of thing, also very unlikely to be in a King's speech.
Ben,
I think, sorry, go on, Benito.
Sorry, I was just going to ask Ben, from your perspective, watching what unfolded in the UK elections, were there any particular things that you were watching as it relates to us as overseas territories?
Well, the key thing that I looked for was, any policy lines or pledges or statements in the manifestos that raised the question of overseas territories. And Labour did have a line there, and it essentially talks about rooting out corruption in connection with the UK itself, the Crown dependencies, and the overseas territories. They also talked about Falklands and Gibraltar, which is pretty standard language in protecting their sovereignty and, of course, maintaining their security. But as Oliver mentioned, prior to the election, a lot of work had been done by the UK government on engaging the overseas territories to develop a new strategy. Now, that was, of course, the Conservative government, but that work is not going to go away. However, Labour is going to want to review it carefully and consider whether or not it falls in line with what their policies are. I think we have to look at some of the headline policies that Labour wants to pursue. For example, closer alignment with the European Union on security matters. This week, there will be a meeting of the European political community in the UK. David Lammy and Keir Starmer will have a big role to play to try to demonstrate that they are serious about working more closely with Europe. Now, where we fall into, British Virgin Islands and other overseas territories fall into UK policy is on security, because public registers are seen through the lens of corruption. So public registers are something that the UK will want to see, but what we are hoping for is that the UK will align its position with the European Union, where this issue has not been settled as yet. As you recall, the ECJ, the European Court of Justice, had a decision on public registers, basically saying that you can't have unrestricted access to beneficial ownership information. So this issue is still being addressed. And what we would want is for the UK to align its position so that it moves in lock and step with the EU on this. The UK does have its own public register. However, the territories have said they would like to move with the EU on the development of policy toward public registers. We have accepted legitimate interests. That means, those individuals, institutions, persons that have a legitimate interest and reason for accessing beneficial ownership information should be able to have it. Well, the EU agrees with that. The longer term prospect of a full public register, full access, that is yet to be determined by the EU. But we want the UK to work with the EU and align it, because that benefits our position in terms of continuing our financial services industries, making sure, of course, that they are fully in the fight against illicit finance, but not wiped out by having full public access to the registers that we put in place.
We've had some very strong parliamentarians or key parliamentarians who've traditionally held very strong position on issues that Ben just articulated, and the Operation International Finance Centers. Mitch and Oliver, how do you think that those key figures, and you can articulate who they are, will influence, or they might influence, the future policies with regards to how the Labour relates to its overseas territories?
I think it's actually two things, because I don't think it's just elected or unelected anymore. I think it's also civil servants. So firstly, the likes of Margaret Hodge, one of the people I assume you're alluding to, has now been elevated to the House of Lords. Now, she's going to be even more vocal in the House of Lords. And in fact, I think she's set to get some sort of anti-corruption SAR role, where she'll sit on a panel that advises the Treasury on clamping down on illicit finance. So we're likely to hear quite a lot from her. We also currently have Andrew Mitchell, who's the shadow foreign secretary, and obviously he's shadow. He's obviously not got the power of the foreign secretary, but it does give him a platform to align with the Labour Party and to bring up his concerns and his views, especially around things like public registers. But one thing to be really clear on is Sue Gray, who is Keir Starmer's chief of staff, used to be a very high profile figure in the civil service, knows how Whitehall works like the back of her hand. One of the big changes she wants to make is to have a much more civil service-led government, in a sense that ministers don't don't just make their decision. They make decision based on the facts and figures that are provided for them by the UK civil service. Now, what that means is we're at a bit of a difficult juncture because views of civil service are likely to be heard a lot more in the corridors of power with the MPs and ministers than they were under a Conservative Party, where a lot of civil servants were listened to, but their advice not adhered to. So what I would say is you've probably got quite a prominent voice of Margaret Hodge in the Lords. You've currently got a shadow foreign secretary who sits alongside Margaret Hodge. And then you've also got the voice of civil servants, which means any work in the future of relationships all comes down to how do you sort of build a new cohort of supportive MPs, because a lot of MPs who were happy to go out and bat for not just BVI, but the entire sort of Crown dependencies and overseas territory, some of them lost their seats or stood down. But what's really good to know, Stephen Doughty, who is the minister responsible for the OTs, is a really big friend of the BVI. He's been on holiday with his family. He says it's one of the most beautiful places in the world, and he's desperate for his next trip to the BVI. So, there's quite a complicated picture out there because a lot of it's going to be driven by civil servants. A lot of it's going to be driven from pressure from the Lords. But you've also got a very supportive and willing to engage ministerial team. He said he wants to engage. He wants to support the British family. He wants to work collaboratively. And that's a really positive first noises coming out of government. I guess what we'll start to see is how influential Margaret Hodge is from the Lords, but then also how impactful the civil service can be and what their advice is. Oliver, sorry, I don't know if you have anything else to add.
Oliver?
Yeah, just on the generalities and then the specifics of beneficial ownership registers. So in general terms, completely agree with what Mitchell said. I would add to that, the civil servants, without naming individuals, that would be inappropriate, but civil servants in the UK government have been very supportive of an approach that's collaborative and that tries to encourage rather than forcing the overseas territories to move towards what UK government standard has been. So if it is a civil servant-led approach, then I think that's a positive thing for BVI and the other international financial centres. On top of that, I think it's worth noting that even at a political level, the one sort of unifying factor, regardless of Keir Starmer's own personal political views, where he stands on left or right or soft left or whatever, he's filled his parliamentary party as much as he could, and then he's filled his government with as many people as he could, of people who are intellectually and ideologically malleable. I don't mean people that have centrist views. I don't mean people who have no views. I mean people that are happy to get to change their views to get stuff done, or to change the public policy they espouse to get stuff done, often based on personal loyalty to himself. There's a large number of people that he's known for many, many years, particularly from Camden. Well, I was previously the leader of the Conservatives, by the way. So as a consequence, that is a unifying theme. That means he's probably going to be more fleet-footed in redirecting the political pressure within government to what needs to be done to get through the political agenda. That doesn't mean necessarily taking a civil service-led approach, but it does mean he's got rid of quite a lot of the more left-wing, but also more ideological in other ways, members of the government who would otherwise want to push back on official advice that they might disagree with. There's a few exceptions to that. Ed Miliband is the most obvious one within government in the environment brief. But otherwise, the government is very, very intellectually malleable and probably would be responsive to civil service advice that says we need to be more collaborative, notwithstanding Margaret Hodge. In terms of beneficial ownership registers, it's worth noting that of the two major party manifestos, only the Conservative Party manifesto mentioned beneficial ownership registers in the overseas territories. It committed to continuing to want to require the overseas territories to adopt public registers. Obviously, that manifesto is moot and is in a dustbin of history now, but it's worth noting it was there. And then one of the greatest advocates of requiring the overseas territories to adopt public registers is Tom Tugendhat. He was the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee at a time when he was advocating for it. He then joined the government and had to take the government line. But his personal views are to require the overseas territories to adopt public registers. And right now he's the second favourite to become leader of the Conservative Party in the ongoing or upcoming, depending on how you frame it, leadership election within the Conservative Party. So interestingly, it might be the case that whilst Labour have become more comfortable taking a collaborative long-term approach because they're in government for the next 5 years, and because they want to have a collaborative approach that's led by the civil service advice in this matter, it might be the Conservative Party, because of its stance and because of its potential leader, might take a more combative approach. That's an interesting inversion of where they've historically been as parties.
Okay.
I think it's also interesting to note Ben's views around sort of that closer collaboration with the EU, because Starmer has already come out and said he wants to work closely with the EU and look for synergies and where they can work together. So they're, as you said, they're coming to I think they're in Blenheim this week for the European Community Political Summit, and that's probably an area where they could work together on. You know, why diverge on things like beneficial ownership registers when you could work together and come to an approach where the territories have agreed. So that's a really interesting one to follow.
Yeah.
Well, at least just one more point, and just to say, under 14 years of Conservative Party rule, the relationship between the UK and overseas territories was really strained. I mean, badly. And I don't think Labour wants to continue that trend. I think Labour wants to demonstrate that they are a friend to the overseas territories. They don't want to have what appeared to be a colonial relationship. They want to have a collaborative relationship. And I think they will take steps toward re-establishing what was considered a modern partnership between the UK and overseas territories, which actually, and I know Mitch will agree with this. Well, this is Labour's position from the very start. They are the ones who established initially the concept of the modern partnership with the overseas territories. So they have a history of doing that. And so I think that that's where they would like to land. There are some good signals already. As you recall, Hurricane Beryl was just a few weeks ago, and the Cayman Islands was going to be affected. David Lammy called the Cayman Islands to reassure them of the UK's commitment to supporting them in the event that they were hit by Beryl. So I think it's a strong first signal that Labour is committed to the overseas territories, to partnership, to their security. And so we expect a less hostile approach. We understand that the Margaret Hodges of the world and others are going to have their view. But I think if Keir Starmer stays true to his performance during the election and prior to that of being a center-left leader, then he will and his team will be more pragmatic about how they approach the overseas territories. And hopefully it will lead to positive outcomes as opposed to more friction, which is what we've had over the past 14 years, previously under the Conservatives.
And David Lammy, the new Foreign Secretary, is of Caribbean heritage and has been very vocal on a number of issues that have affected the Caribbean, not specifically the overseas territories. Is there anything the overseas territories will be able to leverage from his traditional stance as well as his heritage?
Well, I should also mention that, you know, the UK immediately after the election provided an aid package, assistance package to the affected Caribbean countries, Grenada and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And David Lammy made it a point to make a statement about it and to reach out to the leaders of the prime ministers of those two Caribbean countries. I think it's another strong signal, early signal about the relationship he'd like to have with the Caribbean. And the overseas territories in the Caribbean should benefit from that. I think that David Lammy has expressed his sensitivity about the past and the colonial past and how the Caribbean was affected, its development and so on, by under the British Empire at the time. But he wants to see Britain have a modern relationship, a progressive relationship with the Caribbean. And the major issue I think that he wants to work with the Caribbean on is climate change, because he recognizes that it's an existential threat to the islands there. We have hurricane season almost starting, 3 weeks earlier now. That happened this year. In the BVI, we had torrential rains in early May. And it's not going to get any better. It's going to get worse for the Caribbean. And so the Caribbean has to have a strong partner to assist them. So I think David Lammy will have a focus there. And the overseas territories in the Caribbean, at least I know, will benefit from the climate change related issues that Labour wants to address.
David Lammy is a really interesting character, actually, and it's important to focus a little bit on him because he's quite lucky to be in the position he's in. Because had Rishi Sunak called an election in the autumn, which many people were expecting him to be, David Lammy may not have survived the initial reshuffle. And many of you may have seen some of the comments he made about Donald Trump. And obviously that special relationship is key to the UK's international standing. And we all know that Donald Trump holds a grudge. And one of the key decisions that Starmer had to make pretty early on is, does he stick by someone who's been very loyal and has built very good relationships up across Europe and across the world, and especially in Ukraine, or does he move to a much more a new approach and someone who's a bit more palatable to the Republican Party and to Donald Trump? Now, he's made the decision to stick with David Lammy, and really interestingly, Lammy's team have done quite a big job at working with the new vice president nominee, Vance. He basically hedged his bets on a number of candidates, and it seems like he picked the winner. There's some speculation that Starmer might go for a reshuffle, though, towards the end of this year or into the new year, once the government have settled into a bit more of a rhythm. And there's lots of rumours and lots of names in the frame of who could create that role. But one of the key roles is obviously the UK government have announced they're changing their ambassador to the US. And now speculations move to who that might be, because they will hold a really key role into what that relationship between Trump and the UK government, should it be Trump, it's looking like it could be Trump, at the US election. And one of the names floating about, which is really interesting, is David Miliband, who was the former foreign secretary, obviously lost out at the leadership contest to his brother Ed Miliband in the whole Labour Party leadership psychodrama that took place 14 years ago. And David Miliband is quite bored in New York at the moment. And it's one of the things that he could do is move in to have that role that's a bit more Republican Trump facing and be a conduit between him and David Lammy. And I think it's really interesting because David Lammy has done a really good job at building those international forums, but he was the one person in the cabinet who most people thought was going to lose their job and retained his role. So there's clearly a lot of loyalty from Starmer towards David Lammy, and he's clearly quite well respected because he's kept a role that's not easy to fill, especially when you have a former Prime Minister in David Cameron, who's had that role now for the past year.
Okay.
I would build on what Ben just mentioned about the high priority that the government places on the environment and climate change, and that potentially helping the overseas territories that put a great focus on the green economy and green transition. That, and as well as trying to overcome colonial legacy, are two themes that clearly play to Labour's interests and ideological interests, in particular their base. So if you are looking at the strengths and weaknesses, the positives and negatives for the OTs, and the ledger as to where Conservatives and Labour stand, those are two trump cards that can be played, that do play to the OTs' interests and benefit. But as part of this review of the review into overseas territory strategy, it's really important that the overseas territories make the case together about what they want that modern relationship to look like, and they move lockstep, because there's not a huge amount of time that the OTs will collectively have to shape that review, to persuade David Lammy, Keir Starmer, Stephen Doughty of how extensive the revisions need to be from the version that was prepared by the last government and the civil servants. They don't have a huge amount of time. They don't have a huge window to present lots of different changes and lots of different themes. And if all the different territories were to present all sorts of different uncoordinated perspectives and feedback into that review right now, it would probably overwhelm this new political administration that has 1,000,001 other things on their agenda. So it's absolutely key that overseas territories collectively collaborate together to advance, as Ben just said, like the positive angles that actually are better under this government than they would be under the last government. There are going to be things that are worse, but in the very, very short term, it's important to get across the things that will be better, to get that to shape positively the review that may or may not be extensively revised?
What should be our priorities as overseas territory?
Yeah, well, firstly, there has been a discussion previously about this among the overseas territories. In the lead up to the last Joint Ministerial Council, there was very serious discussion about what the relationship with the UK should look like going forward, because it had to be reframed from being this contentious relationship to being one of partnership. So a few themes came up. One, no overseas territory wants to have impositions by the UK government on it. The governments of the territories want to self-govern. They want to govern their own affairs. They don't want to have the UK Parliament imposing legislation on them, and especially not without consultation. So there was an agreement that we should have a mechanism for consultation when it comes to UK decisions that affect the overseas territories. I don't think Labour is going to disagree with that. I think they would want to consult with the territories before they make certain decisions. Then, as well, in terms of thematic areas, the climate change, as we mentioned, is a very high priority, as well as sustainable development. Currently, overseas territories don't qualify for international climate finance, not via the UN, not in the UK, at least when it comes to its international aid budget. So the UK government, toward the end of the Conservatives' term, began to engage with us on this point. And I think that the Labour government will pick it up because it's a priority, and you cannot be seen to be assisting, let's say in the Caribbean, independent Caribbean countries, providing them with access to climate finance, and the overseas territories to whom you are linked receive nothing from you or nothing substantial from you to address climate change. And Britain is an industrial country. It's part of the grouping of countries that are the major CO2 emitters. They have a responsibility to act on this issue, but they should begin with support to the overseas territories, which has not been substantially provided thus far. There were some funds previously when the UK was a part of the European Union that the territories received via the UK's contribution, but Brexit wiped all of that away, and it was never replaced. So that's another area. So climate change, sustainable development. The blue economy is an area where the territories can leverage their marine resources to advance themselves economically. Economic resilience is something that we have to embed in all of the territories. As you can see, at any point in time, a hurricane could hit in the Caribbean, and you have to be able to bounce back. Similarly, financial services, we have the ups and the downs, the various pressures. We have to make sure that the industry is resilient. We should be working together with the UK on economic resilience to make sure that we can be prosperous in these territories. We don't want a situation where we fall back into poverty or quality of life as standard of living drops, either because of an external shock or because of a UK policy that wasn't properly thought out. So that shouldn't be happening. So I would say that those are, well, there's one more, security. And this aligns with the UK position anyway. Security in all of the territories is important. In the Caribbean, we have an issue throughout the entire subregion of the islands being used to traffic drugs, contraband. We also have the issue of economic migrants popping up in boats and so on. We have those from Venezuela. We have some from Haiti. So there's a real issue of security that we have to work together with the UK on to address it. And so that is the UK's obligation as well via its membership at the UN. They are responsible for ensuring there is proper security in the territories. And I do think that they can do a better job of working with the territories, not simply asking the territories to fund the bulk of it. The UK can contribute more resources that can help the territories to have better security on the ground. So I think that those are the major priority areas, at least as I see them. But my colleagues may have additional ones that they want to talk about.
I'd completely agree with that. I think there's going to be a risk aversion from Keir Starmer's government with anything that comes wrapped in a union flag, because as part of their detoxification of the Labour Party post Corbyn, it's been absolutely essential that people see them as suitably patriotic and actually in love with the country in a way that Corbyn frankly wasn't. And seeing the overseas territories as part of the solution to Britain's problems is a good way of doing that. Now, clearly, if you look at some of the responsibilities that the Foreign Secretary has, some of them are not actually foreign affairs, including, coincidentally, the relationship with the overseas territories and international development and development assistance, which was previously a separate government ministry, but is now obviously part of the Foreign Secretary's domain. Now, if you look at the impact that IFCs, such as the overseas territories, have had on the developing world and emerging economies, it's been overwhelmingly positive. But the narrative that you get from NGOs about what the impact has been is that they've been negative. And if you listen to the shadow Foreign Secretary, Andrew Mitchell, he thinks that IFCs have generally been negative for sub-Saharan Africa and other developing countries. And that's a battle that can now be won. And it can now be set in stone, the facts that overseas territories help channeling investment into less developed economies that would otherwise be dependent on international development aid. That's a pivot that not just the OTs, but also the Crown dependencies, Jersey and Guernsey, have been branding themselves as doing that for a while. OTs could very well do the same, particularly with David Lammy as Foreign Secretary. They don't want to have to hammer the overseas territories for that reason of risk aversion, and giving the Foreign Secretary opportunities to say positive things about the overseas territories and the impact that they have on the world and British geopolitical objectives is, I wouldn't say it's an open door, but it's a door that's slightly ajar, and it's only slightly ajar for the meantime, whereby there is that sort of rethink about how they want to talk about the overseas territories.
Certainly, and of course we also as overseas territory produced our report. We've done 2 reports on the BVI's global contribution. The last one was Beyond Globalization, the BVI's contribution to the global economy and the scenarios that came about as a result of that. But beyond that, Ben, you mentioned that prior or around the JMC, the overseas territories got together and came up with, I guess, an agenda on how you're going to respond to the issues collaboratively. Has there been any effort, to your knowledge, for them to come together post July 4th on how we're going to move forward with the new Labour government? I mean, you all have provided excellent analysis on what has transpired and what the future would look like. And we also having discussions about the British family, not just a modern partnership. So are we going to be included more as part of the British family? And as such, what does that mean? And how are we preparing for that inclusion?
Yes, well, the leaders of the overseas territories have already sent a joint letter to the Foreign Secretary requesting that there is a joint ministerial council meeting in November, because I think there was an open question as to whether or not we would have the annual meeting. So a letter has been submitted saying we would like to have that meeting because we believe that we should, as soon as possible, have a discussion about the priority areas for the relationship and how we're going to partner going forward. So the territories are preparing for that engagement. And in the lead up to it, we will have meetings on various issues so that we come to if the UK does have the meeting, and I expect that they will agree to have it, that we will have a position to put forward on how we would like to work with the UK, the new Labour government going forward. I just want to take a step back on a point that Oliver was making about the Foreign Secretary having good talking points, that he can use to highlight how, the territories benefit the UK. And we should remember, I mean, the territories are in lock and step with the UK in the fight against illicit finance. And we have to look at, for example, Russian sanctions, right? And that's a geopolitical issue as well. We have been at the center of it. So there's a lot of good news that we can share, that David Lammy will be able to share once he reviews, once he and Tom and Stephen Doughty go over their portfolio and all of their files. They will see that we have been intimately involved. We have been effective. We have been successful. There are sanctions units being set up in the overseas territories that do not have them. So we are a good partner for the UK, and that's the message that we need to ensure comes across to all of those new MPs that are now in the parliament. We need to get away from the previous narrative, right, under conservative rule that we are a headache for the UK. We are a problem for the UK, right? The UK has to impose itself because things just aren't right in the overseas territories. We want to shift the narrative away to say, look, the effective partners, the financial services industries, the governments are working with the UK on Russian sanctions and illicit finance. We are going to be examples of how you can build climate resilience together. I mean, these are the kind of things that we want, the kind of messaging that we want to come across in this parliament in the UK.
I completely agree with everything before I launch into what I'm about to say. Absolutely, completely agree. However, I'm going to put a bit more of a downbeat spin on it because I think it's important we don't get overexcited about what a Labour government could mean for not just BVI, but for the entire OTs. Because I think at the heart of it, we've always got to remember Labour Party ideology. And it was only 5 years ago where Jeremy Corbyn in his leader's speech, called out Cayman and called out BVI as, corrupt nations, right? And the Labour Party have moved miles from there, absolutely miles. But at the heart of the Labour Party is this sort of a sense of equality and cutting down on things like corruption and I think although there's really positive messaging, and I think that's absolutely the right approach, it's going to be very difficult to get through some of the barriers that are in our way. Things like their actual, the NEC and Labour Party activists. And we've got to remember that back in the last parliament, where obviously there's a large Conservative majority, 1% of politicians understood anything about financial services. Our elected officials in the UK, our elected politicians in the UK are hugely uneducated in terms of broad geopolitics, in terms of financial services. And there's a huge job to be done to re-educate and upskill a lot of our politicians here in the UK. So if I were to say to a brand new MP who's just come in at the age of 23, what are your thoughts on the BVI? I would assume that a lot of them have been impacted on where the previous Labour Party had been. So that's not to discredit everything we've discussed, because I think that's absolutely right. But what I think the first part is a huge education piece. What we need to do is detoxify any negative brands in order that new MPs and future stars of the Labour Party and the future foreign secretaries and the future OT ministers are more than happy to engage and have those positive conversations. And I think we're in a good place. And I think David Lammy wants to be collaborative. Stephen Doughty is a huge fan of BVI and OTs. It's the people around them and below them that could have more of an impact. I hark back to Margaret Hodge because she's very, very close to the Labour leadership. She's a good friend of Keir Starmer. And she's got a group of people behind her that are still in Parliament who could also be forces of negativity. And what we need to do is we need to neutralise those with those positive messages, but we also need to educate. And it's about not just targeting those top tier people, but it's targeting the full new Labour Parliamentary Party and getting them to appreciate the benefits of the British family, getting them to talk about how you can work together and the work you're doing and giving them that positive news, not just the Foreign Secretary, because the Foreign Secretary at the end of the day is answerable to the Labour Party and the Labour Party membership. even though that they've been elected with a huge mandate. So completely agree. Just a bit more of a weary eye on the positivity, I would say, because I don't think it's going to be as an open door to go in and talk and be positive and have a collaborative. I think initially they're going to be very collaborative, and they're really portraying in the first few weeks of government that they're, the adults are back at the table. We want to be collaborative. We want to discuss everything starting afresh. Now let's work together. What the OTs need to do is really demonstrate, we're willing to work with you. We've got a really positive story, and it's the perfect time to do that. I think the UK government at the same time need to try not to get distracted by the rest of the geopolitics that's happening around them. I would say the relationship with the OTs and the British family is not in their top 10 priorities, the government. So how do we increase it into their prioritization, but also get them to really focus and not make it 6 months until they get to focus on this? And at which point, the civil servants have had input. Some of their parliamentarians who aren't as well educated have put some more negative positions forward. So just a little word of caution on that one from my point of view.
Certainly.
Yeah, and
Oliver, go ahead.
So just to add to that, I think that the Labour Party leadership wants to do that education piece for their new MPs as well. This is not just a job for BVI government or IFC Forum or other stakeholders, although clearly we do have to do that work. But rather, in addition, the Labour Party leadership will want to do that. So when they were weeding out people that would be problematic for them in the new intake of MPs, they were looking at a few key litmus tests. They weren't looking for ideological centrists per se, but they were looking at some litmus tests as to whether those new intake would be aligned or sympathetic to or smell like Jeremy Corbyn and his previous leadership. And there were things around Israel and Gaza. There were things around NATO and the nuclear deterrent. There were things around nationalization of industry. They were not fundamentally about things like the relationship with the overseas territories or financial services, frankly, more generally. Those were not litmus tests that were looked at. And so there will be a long tail of misconceptions, particularly amongst young MPs. Some MPs were elected at the age of 22 in this election. So they will quite literally have had no political knowledge. They would have been 13 when Jeremy Corbyn became leader of the Labour Party in 2015. They will have no long tail of experience of what it looks like in government when they were barely alive themselves in the last Labour government. So that education piece needs to happen because it's not one of the litmus tests that they use to root out wrong-uns as they saw them. But they do want to make sure that no embarrassing statements are made that undermine their rebranding of the Labour Party as a patriotic party. So,
Oliver, what is the IFC Forum strategy in the response to the caution that and Mitchell are offering?
Great question, actually. So Mitchell, as well as the credentials that he mentioned, Lansons are the public affairs advisors to IFC Forum as well. So yeah, both legal and public affairs advisors to the forum on this call. I think if I'm going to basically narrate Mitchell's own strategy, so I might throw to him on that particular point. But he's already outlined how important engagement with the new regime is, and I'm sure he can detail more if he'd like.
Yeah, absolutely. I think initial engagement, as I said, it's so important to have early engagement. And I don't mean early engagement that's war and peace of all the incredible things. It's a bit more of a tick box exercise. What they'll do is they'll look through the list of who's congratulated me, who's not congratulated me, right? It's a tick box, the Secretary of State, let's just use David Lammy as an example, is not going to read every single congratulations letter or email that comes into his inbox. His civil servants will, and that's the first tick box exercise. What it then does is you open up a door for a future conversation. You sort of float a future dialogue or a future visit or a future conversation around registers of beneficial ownership or some of the moving the conversation on, as we've discussed. It's not just about registers, it's about sustainability and working together, the British family, the review. So what we're trying to is speak to the top, but appreciating that it's going to be noisy and it's not a priority. It's also about speaking to the bottom and speaking to those up and coming influential stars, people to look out for. So things like people like Douglas Alexander, who many also thought could replace David Lammy, but they're going to be hugely influential in some of that policy development. It's also looking across government, not just focusing on FCDO. So Department for Business and Trade, again, making that really important that really important message around trade. DESNES, the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, again, working together on sustainability, blue carbon, and Treasury. And we know Treasury are a lot more pragmatic, and Treasury are going to be pulling all the strings across government. So not only is it the breadth of government that it's important to speak to, but it's also how we speak to them. And Labour, it's a bit of a change after 14 years to speak a language of Labour, right? We know their guiding principle for everything is about growth. They've thrown the kitchen sink at creating economic growth. They ruled out in the general election increasing taxation on working people, and they've ruled out any cuts to public finances. So the only way they can get the economy to be able to spend on some of their key policy platforms, except for a couple of tax increases like things like private school fees and cutting down on non-doms, is through economic growth. And every single engagement we have, it's about framing it in how you as BVI, how you as the OTs, how the British family can really drive that economic growth that the UK needs. And there's a huge amount to talk about. You know, as you've alluded to, Elise, about the report BVI Finance has published. But we need to speak in the language that's going to be palatable to Labour. And then all those positive things that we've just previously discussed are possible to happen. If we continue to stick on some of the narrative we've had with the Conservative Party, or we don't go back to basics and start afresh, we risk falling into some of the traps that the former government have set and the former some of those difficult conversations we've had. So I would say it's engaging with a lot of people, not just the FCDO, not just our key stakeholders, but across government and also from the bottom, but also speaking in a way that Labour understand, things around skills, growth, and giving opportunities to people who might not have those opportunities.
Okay, Ben, have those letters, congratulations, so that they can tick the boxes, gone out, if you can say, from the BVI?
Yeah, of course. The BVI has already congratulated the new Prime Minister, the new Foreign Secretary, the new OT Minister. And of course, we'll be doing the same with Treasury and the DEFRA, as well as the department responsible for climate change. But I just want to say that the having a parliamentary contact program is very important for all of the overseas territories. I mean, these are a lot of new MPs, and a lot of work will have to go into speaking with them, briefing them, as Mitch has said. But there's a big opportunity ahead at the Labour Party conference that'll happen in September, as well as the other party conferences. I think Oliver will tell you that the Conservative Party conference will be something of a week. People will be licking their wounds, but certainly at the Labour Party conference, perhaps as well as the Lib Dem, there's an opportunity to participate and to engage the MPs. There'll be lots of fringe events, lots of discussion, lots of different stakeholders, NGOs, trying to jockey to influence future Labour policy. And so the overseas territories should be a part of the process. We should spare no effort, spare no resources to be present and make our case. I've attended many of them, and both of my colleagues here have done it as well. There's a real opportunity. And it also means that as overseas territories, we have to do a bit of work ahead of the party conference because we're quite small in the greater scheme of things. So working together is the best way to get to have a bigger voice in the room. So that is what we have to do to seize the opportunity now. The Parliament will rise at the end of July, and the big issues that are in tray for the UK government are things like the NATO summit that just passed, as well as the issues in the Middle East with Israel and Gaza. Those things are occupying the attention of the new government right now, but they'll have a slight break in August. They'll come back to Parliament. And I think we have to jump on things as quickly as we can and then get to that party conference and have an impact.
Okay.
Benita,
I'm going to open now floor, sorry, Mitchell, to questions. We have two questions. I think we've already answered them. But specifically about the new overseas territories, Minister Stephen Dowdy. And Mitchell, you said he's a big fan of the BVI having a vacation here. But what should be our number one issue that we place on his agenda? Because he has the responsibility to address the issues. And I know for us, our financial services, you talk about, Benito, you talked about economic resilience. And you talked about how important that is for us as overseas territories and the wider region. But for us, economic resilience right now lies in our financial services industry. And our financial services industry is the sector that has sustained us after Hurricane Irma. It's a sector that sustained us during COVID. How do we get that message across to Stephen Doughty that economic resilience is equal to maintaining our financial services industry and not making sure that anything that would impede us continuing in that successful trend? So how do we communicate that message to Stephen Doughty, and how do we get it at the top of his agenda?
I think Stephen's already quite well informed. So I know from conversations we had with him ahead of the election, and it's great that he's kept the role, because there was a big fear that, everyone's built up a good relationship with Stephen, and he's been very communicative and very engaged. And then a new person comes in who's not as engaged or interested. In fact, he's so interested that he's even asked to have the crown dependency thrown into his remit, because he actually is genuinely really interested in the whole British family space. So he's already well informed, and I'm not sure there's a huge amount more to do to persuade him. I think what we need to do, though, is empower him to be a positive voice within the FCDO. As I mentioned right at the beginning, it's going to be a much more civil service led government. And, we all know the conversations around things like COI. What we need to be able to do is empower Stephen to feel like he can either stand up to, if necessary, or get the arguments across to his civil servants, or David Lammy, should he need to. And I would say a lot of that work has been done, but now he's in government, we need to empower him further, that he's got the facts and figures at the end of his fingertips. He knows he can pick up the phone to Benito whenever he needs to, which I'm sure he does anyway. But, he needs to be able to feel that he can be the voice of BVI and the OTs within the FCDO. And I think that commitment that Benito was speaking about around coming over, having a conversation, engaging, empowering, is going to be really impactful and effective for Stephen. He wants to be armed. He doesn't want to go in there with a negative view. He wants to go in there with positives. As I've said, he loves BVI. He said it's the most beautiful place he's ever holidayed. So he wants that positive message. We need to empower him to have the confidence and the knowledge to be able to and be our voice in government.
We have a question.
Just to pick up on that, one of the examples that we have to present to any stakeholder, including Stephen Doughty, who we like very much. You look at Hurricane Beryl's impact in the Caribbean. What happened in Carriacou, in Grenada, and Union Island in St. Vincent is what happened to us in 2017. Complete and utter devastation. The people there will have to be relocated. And we have to remind our partners that when we were devastated, the one industry that kept us going, which prevented the UK Treasury from having to make huge payouts to us, was the fact that the financial services industry was resilient and continued on. And this is what we have to remind them of. It's one thing from an academic perspective to talk about, making big changes to the industry because that is a political objective of certain UK parliamentarians. But the reality is that if this industry fails, who is on the hook to pay? It's the UK Treasury. So pragmatism needs to be an important part of the discussion, right? And it's not to say that we're against, combating illicit finance. We are completely supportive of the UK in doing that. But we have to remind them that economic resilience means, in our context, keeping our industry going in the midst of external shocks like hurricanes, changes in the international regulatory landscape, and other things. But this industry is vital, especially if the UK Treasury doesn't want to have to make payouts to us.
We have a question from our audience. Do you think that there would, in the long term, be reduced UK support, and could any economic disruption negatively impact the creditworthiness of the territories, making it more difficult and expensive for them to borrow funds for development and public service?
If I can add to what Benito just said, I think one of the advantages and possibly one of the reasons why David Lammy came straight out the blocks on the 5th of July, within minutes of being appointed Foreign Secretary, to make that, I think it was £500,000 grant to Cayman, was to make sure that there was a perception that UK did stand foursquare behind the OTs. Now, in the grand scheme of things, even within the budgets of OTs, let alone the UK, £500,000 is not a gigantic amount. But I think it was it's a deliberate statement of intent. But as Ben said, BVI's financial services sector and revenue from licenses is 3 orders of magnitude bigger than that. It's hundreds of millions of dollars. And maintaining that revenue stream it needs to be the priority for the UK government if they're looking at sustainability of public finances in the territories. But I think it was helpful the government was able to come out straight away and say, by the way, here's a statement of intent. We are standing with the territories. Immediately upon forming governments, it's always been a tradition that the governments always say, the new government coming in says, oh, well, now that we've been able to open the books, now that we've been able to see on the inside how things are worse than we expected. So we now need to break some of our promises. We have to cut back spending, or we have to increase taxes that we didn't intend to increase. And Labour have done that. It's not a particularly credible line, but they've done that a tiny bit in the last few days to try to give themselves wiggle room. But one thing that's not going to be cut, clearly, and this is key from that indicative move on day one, is the need to support in the face of particularly crises, like weather events. But just going forwards, I don't think there's going to be a change in that.
Just in terms of the question about borrowing, right? I should just state that the UK government has been very supportive at the level of public servants, as well as ministers, of borrowing by overseas territories governments for legitimate reasons. There has not been an issue with that, right? The UK government, of course, prefers that we borrow on our own credit, on the strength of our own credit. But the UK government is prepared to give an implicit guarantee. They've expressed that even during the worst of times. They've expressed that, because I think, the Treasury has a very high threshold in terms of officially backing or underwriting loans for any other partner, overseas territory, any other partner within the government. So there hasn't really been an issue in that regard. What we are asking the UK government to do, however, is to assist us with being able to access climate finance, because right now we are blocked from it. In terms of concessional financing, for example, you can get 2 percentage points lower. It's for in certain instances if it's for climate projects, but we don't have access to that, and that's a problem. So we need the UK government to work with us on engaging into the international development banks, development institutions, other partners that are prepared to lend to us to give us a discount when it comes to climate-related projects, climate-related infrastructure. Because as many of you may know or maybe don't, it's very expensive to build infrastructure, especially coastal infrastructure that's climate resilient. Very expensive. So the territories could benefit very much from having UK support to help access climate finance. And the UK has pledged that they will do it, at least under the previous government, and we're hopeful that this government will take that forward still.
Okay, Darren, I hope that answers your question sufficiently. We have another question from Fanny Evans, and she said she wasn't really confident in David Lammy's, when he gave his speech on kleptocracy, he did not sound so understanding of the OT business model. A question is, should or would the OT use of the public registry, sue the public registry in the courts, given the precedents in the EU courts and in the US about public registers? I think I'll send that one to Oliver.
Yeah, so just I want to address the ECJ judgment from 2022, and I did a previous BVI finance presentation on that. So the judgment was slightly more nuanced than to say that it was illegal to have public registers. Rather, it said that it was illegal for the European Union under its treaties to require its member states to have them. But it left open the possibility that member states could introduce them of their own accord as long as they are not required to by the EU. It didn't expressly reach the conclusion that they could, but it left open that door. Really, the mechanism by which EU member states could be found to not be able to introduce them is under the European Convention of Human Rights and a judgment of the European Court of Human Rights, which is a different process. It's a slower process, but more interestingly, it's a process that binds both the overseas territories and the UK itself, because the UK extended the ECHR to the overseas territories. So as a consequence, if the ECHR prohibits, under its requirement for respect for private life and confidentiality of papers, if it prohibits public registers being introduced by signatory countries, obviously for this purpose includes BVI and the OTs, if it does, then that is a grounds for optimism. And the potential of the question, Fanny's question specifically asked whether the OT should bring a claim in those courts. That would be a different court, the ECHR, rather than EU court. Rest assured, there are plenty of claims being brought already by persons within Europe that would happily bring forward that claim. Within the US. In the US, I'm not sure there's jurisprudential crossover. I can't speak to that. I'm not sure why there would be, but certainly you already see the claim that was brought again by the National Small Business Federation, I think it was, in the Northern District of Alabama, where there was an initial at the first instance of finding that requiring non-public registers even in the US was unconstitutional overreach. So it's interesting that their jurisprudence goes even further. That claim still has to go through appeal. It's going to a circuit court now, but I'm not sure that has any direct impact on BVI.
Okay, I apologize. That question was not from Fanny, but we'll move on to the next question. What impact with a Labour government on removing the Order in Council, and will there be an internal review of progress towards completing the COI recommendations? I'm not sure that this question is specifically for this panel discussion, but in terms of the Order in Council, with respect to public registers, maybe Oliver, you can address that one specifically.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's worth addressing because there's a lot of misconceptions in Westminster, the UK, I guess around the world, about what that Order in Council said. all it said is that the British government at the time, this is 2018, the British government at the time had to lay before Parliament an order in council that would requiring the overseas territories that hadn't yet introduced public registers to do so. The laying before Parliament of a legislative instrument does not mean the bringing of it into effect. It does not mean putting it to a vote. It simply means effectively file it in the House of Commons and the House of Lords libraries. So that is what the government did. So that order in council, the obligations on the UK government under the order in council, it doesn't need to be revoked. They've met their obligations under the Sanctions Anti-Money Laundering Act 2018 by laying that order in council in before Parliament. So the question, therefore, is what is its ongoing meaning and consequences? And the answer is, it is I guess if there were a member of Parliament, or if the government did want to legislate to introduce it, they do have this off-the-shelf, oven-ready option that has been effectively deemed to be lawful by the last government. The last government drafted it. Clearly, they did not draft it thinking it could not be implemented. So I guess it gives any government or MP that wanted to reach for it and wanted to introduce it some oven-ready text. But it is not coming into effect. It does not need to come into effect, and there's no need to repeal anything.
Okay.
But there might be a perception there is. So perception in politics, perception is reality. So
okay. So we're going to wrap up now. We just have a few minutes left, and I'm going to ask all of you to just give your final analysis in terms of the impact of the Labour government on international finance centers like the BVI, as well as our financial services industry, and what we should be doing now in preparation for any upcoming policies or anything that we may hear coming out of the Labour government. I know you have addressed some of it, and you feel very strongly that it's going to be a public service-led initiative in terms of how they view the overseas territories. So what should we as international finance centers, both in the public as well as the private sector, be doing going forward? So Mitchell, Oliver, and then I'll end with you, Benita.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I think this is a positive time. There's positive time with risk attached to it, and I think the slate's been wiped clean. There's a really good opportunity to educate and inform and discuss and make that commitment to working together. And as I said, as long as it's framed in those key Labour priorities of growth and skills, I think there's huge amounts of opportunity. However, there's a risk of external actors and external factors that do create some conflicting ideologies and conflicting views, that it will be a power of personality and it will be a power of commitment. And therefore, what I would say is, I think, as Benito set out, that early engagement, having those conversations, starting afresh will be so important, and really bringing out the positives of how important the financial services of the BVI and the OTs as a whole will be, especially to UK growth. And if you can land that point between the importance of the financial services and the OTs to UK economic growth through investment, then I think there is a winning formula there to have a much more productive relationship as there was previously.
Yeah, just to build on that, I mean, there are positives and negatives that come from this new government for the OTs and IFCs generally. And I think whether it turns out to be a net positive or negative will depend on how fast the overseas territories can act. Keir Starmer clearly, deliberately before the election, got the barnacles off the boat. He deliberately decided to have as little down on paper as possible about what Labour's plans would be. You got the themes, as Mitchell said, about growth, and there'll be some ideological predispositions that Labour have, such as around the environment. But otherwise, everything is to play for. That was a criticism that was quite legitimately levelled at him during the election campaign. But Keir Starmer decided to keep to that strategy of not tipping his hand, of not declaring what his policies would be. And in part, that's because, as Mitchell said earlier, there haven't been the resources available to them as an opposition. There haven't been the civil servants giving official advice. Now there are both the funding available for development of key policy areas and official advice, both available to them. But we are standing in quick-setting cement. And if we can get the message across to the UK government, the new ministers such as David Lammy and Stephen Doughty, some of whom have been sold and some of them have not been sold already on the IFCs, but get the case across as quickly as possible that the OTs and the IFCs generally are force multipliers for British interest that achieve their objectives like those of growth, then it will be net positive. And if we can't, it will be net negative.
So,
well, I think the starting point for both sides has to be a commitment to reestablish a modern partnership. And then we have to define what that modern partnership looks like. And part of that process, I think, should be how we address financial services. If we can make a positive case on the basis of a modern partnership that our industries can be mutually beneficial to the UK and ourselves, but also to the wider world, then we can find where we can cooperate and then still make some adjustments to address issues like illicit finance. We have to get this relationship started off on the right foot. We don't want to have lawsuits flying back and forth. We don't want to have public confrontations between the UK and ourselves over public registers. We want to find a way to address the issue on the basis of a modern partnership. We have to engage at every level. There are ministerial level engagement, there's civil servant level engagement, and then there's parliamentary engagement. And we should spare no effort in these early days in reaching out at every level to all of our partners to tell them that we want a good relationship, we want a modern partnership, we think it can work, let's have a conversation about it and come up with something that works for the long term. So that is how I see it. I think we should work on that basis. And thank you so very much for this opportunity. It was fantastic.
I think it was fantastic as well. And I am going to wrap up by saying the overseas territories, as Oliver said, is a force multiplier, or is it Mitchell? Is a force multiplier for the British Isles. And that is the message that we want to take forward. And economic resilience of our financial services industry, of our economies, is very contingent on us having a positive relationship with the United Kingdom government. I think we've had some excellent input this morning, this afternoon, if you're in the UK, from our very experienced and expert panelists, Mitchell Cohen, Oliver Cooper, Benito Wheatley. Thank you very much for an excellent discussion. And this has been another BVI Finance Breakfast or Afternoon Forum. I am Elise Donovan for BVI Finance, and we thank our panelists and we thank you, our audience. We've been 80 plus strong throughout, and we thank you for joining us for this very interesting discussion. Do have a pleasant day.